These cuttings have been propagating in water for a couple of months, so it's time to pot them up and put them on a pole. Now what I'm going to do today is not specific to just a cutting. You could also apply the same principle to a small plant that's already potted up but does not have a moss pole just yet, and you're wanting to give that plant its first moss pole. Let's have a look at this cutting first. This one is Philodendron atabapoense, and this one has sentimental value because I lost mine last year. I kept it outside during winter and it did not like the cold, so it completely died. Luckily, a few years ago, I already propagated this plant, gave it to Tim. Tim grew it up a moss pole, and when it reached the top of his moss pole, I took a few cuttings. So now I have my plant back. So it's always good to give a little insurance policy to your friend in case you mess up. Hang on, how many cuttings are in there? There's actually 3. The third cutting has only now activated a growth shoot over here. One cutting has a new shoot already over here with new roots coming out here, and the other one has and the other one was the top cutting, so that has quite a large internal spacing and some aerial roots here. Now, technically, I don't like this over here. I don't think this is the best cutting to put on a pole because it is already climbed a little bit. I like the other cutting a little bit better because the new growth is going to be as slow as possible on the moss pole, meaning that I will have the most time between having to do an extension or a chop and extend and so on. But overall, these are still smallish cuttings. I'm not taking a long vine and I'm now putting it on a moss pole and then the vine is already reaching the top of it. Now, while I talk to you about it a little bit more, let me just get going with this process. What we need today is we obviously need the plant, we need a pot, we need a pole. I have chosen a Grow Vertical pole with the plastic backing, and I have a full video on how I choose between the different types of supports and poles and when I choose which one. Over here, I'm pretty certain that at some stage this plant is going to end up in my garden or my greenhouse, at least over summer. So it's going to be backed up against a fence and or a wall, which means that I want all leaves to be on one side of the pole. So I don't need a 360-degree pole. Instead, I go for plastic backing because it has more water retention instead. This plant, when it matures, it grows really long petioles, ginormous leaves. I cannot have that 360 degrees around the pole. It would take up my entire living room. So pushing it up against a wall into a corner is the best way. So it makes sense to then have plastic because you can push it against the wall without ruining the wall. And then I have a tub of aeroid mix over here. Now I actually want to try something new with my aeroid mix. I want to incorporate a bit of slow release fertilizer. These are worm casting pellets actually. And it's a sample that this company has sent me. So this is not out and about just yet. And they just asked me to test it. So I started using it everywhere in my garden. I sprinkled it on top of my moss poles. I started diluting some in water and then watering, and now I figured might as well put it in my aeroid mix as well. That's the logical place to put it, right? I should definitely wear a face mask while using the aeroid mix, but I want to talk to you guys, so YOLO. Really important, put the pole all the way to the bottom of your pot over here, which means that the pole is going to go to here. So I'm only going to fill from here upwards with moss. I just want to fill it now, just because that makes my life a little bit easier. I prefer that. Now you also don't have to fill the entire pole with moss. You can also just fill the part that the plant is attached to, but there's a couple of reasons why I prefer filling it all the way, or as much as I can before I run out of moss. First of all, specifically the Atabapoense actually is also going to send out roots up into the pole. So the pole is not just a support. It's not just the part that the plant is attached to. It's also a vertical extension of the root system. So the plant can grow roots up into the pole. So the more pole, the more roots, the better. Yes, eventually there will be a root sticking out the top. That is okay. It will eventually just touch the air and then dry out, but that root can then grow secondary roots all throughout the pole, right? So I want, hang on, I need a chopstick. So I want as much roots as possible, but instead of just providing it with a big pot, I provide the bulk of the media that the plant can root into via this vertical extension, aka the moss pole. I also want to really fill it so the mesh almost bulges out a little bit. Moss is what retains the moisture. The more moss you've got in there, the better the water retention of this pole will be, the less often it will dry out, the less frequently you have to water, right? So if you just flake moss in here, of course it's going to dry out really, really quickly. That is then also the second part why I like to fill the poles to the top. Gravity is going to make water drain down. So when I water from the top, the water is going to drain down, which means that the bottom is going to stay moist for the longest and the top is going to dry out first. If the plant is attached to this part down below, and or you want the plant attached to this part down below, roots are attracted to moisture, so you want to keep this part moist. Now that's easy because the top dries out first. It dries out over here, and then over the course of a week or so it's slowly gonna dry out more and more and more until the part that the plant is attached to is also drying out, and that's when you need to water again. If I only fill it to here, that journey starts here. So within just 2 or 3 days, the part that the plant has attached to will already be dry, which is not what you want. That also means that as the plant climbs up, the watering frequency will increase and increase and increase because there's more and more and more of the plant on a part of the pole that is about to dry out. So as the plant grows up, I increase my watering frequency, but I use less volume. So I only water the top part of the pole, not enough for it to drain all the way through so that the bottom isn't absolutely getting soaked. I set it up like this for now because at the beginning at least it is creating the least work, and eventually once the plant grows up higher and higher, you'd fill it anyway. So eventually we're gonna have the same frequency in which we water, but initially I'm gonna have a bit of an advantage. Alrighty, we put it all the way to the bottom of the pot so that at least the pole and the pot together are stable. I personally do not cable tie anything over here, but you can cable tie it as well. I'm not going to free them at all. I want to do as little damage as possible. But what I want to do is I want to put these pretty low in the pot, to be honest, like really low kind of. And that is because I want these new shoots that I showed you earlier to be as low on this pole as possible so that they can climb up as much as possible. Think about it. If I would put this plant here, then this shoot is already kind of halfway up the pole. If I do it here, then this shoot is at the bottom of the pole. So when I choose the side that faces the moss pole, I'm choosing the side that has the roots. Over here, I'm choosing this side with the 2 roots to face the moss pole. Alrighty, let's do it. The bottom part of this pole is going to be filled with air white mix because it's going to be inside the pot. And that just has less water retention. The pot has less of a surface area, so the pot is going to dry out less often. Here you go, flip it upside down. Maybe a little layer of air white mix first, just a little bit. Put the cuttings in here, and now just top it up with more air white mix. Now, for example, today I ran out of bark on my air white mix, so it's more cocoa chips heavy. And shit like that happens. I don't always have all the ingredients. I also ran out of pumice, so I put a bit more perlite. My air white mix is not always the same, but it always is a mix of water and nutrient retention, aeration and drainage. And I like it chunky, especially with moss poles, because with moss poles you're watering the moss quite frequently anyway, and it drains into the pot. So you want to make sure that it has great aeration and drainage to avoid root rot. I compress the back over here. That is for stability purposes. Look how I can push it up now. I do not compress the medium at the front because that's where the roots will be. Alrighty, done. Let me clean up 1 sec. I'm going to put a few more of these worm castings on top so they slowly water in, and I'm also going to put a few at the top of the pole over here. So they're also going to water through the pole as I water. Now we're going to try and fiddle these roots in here. You go in here. Oopsie, I already broke this one. There we go. And what I do is I take a piece of U-shaped wire and I just pin the plant to this spot on the pole. Be like, you go here. Just so it knows where the pole is and it finds it a bit easier. I'll do the same with this shoot over here. Be like, hey, and this way I can also tell it, why don't you grow in the middle of the pole? And you know, I don't want you to go to the edge of the pole, I want you to be in the middle so that you look good. Alrighty, here we go. I'm just going to water this in now, and keep in mind there's a third shoot that's eventually coming from the pot. And yeah, I can just pick it up like that. Because the aeroid mix is really nice and chunky, it's so light, it literally weighs nothing. After I water it in, I'm not gonna pick it up exactly like that. But in a few weeks time or a few months time, once there's lots and lots of roots, then the roots will keep it all together, right? So do it at your own risk, but I personally haven't really had any issues with that. I've only ever really had issues with that if the plant has root rot and I pick it up and there's no more roots to hold it together. But then it's kind of like a good reminder being like, hey, root rot. Alrighty, before I water this, I want to really quickly recap the process and I want to give you a few top tips over here as well. When you pot up your plant on a moss pole, treat it like a normal repot. You're repotting a plant and then you're just adding a moss pole on there as well. Don't take a moss pole and just push it into an existing pot retrospectively. First of all, your moss pole is probably not going to be really stable because you're not going to push it all the way to the bottom of the pot. And secondly, you're probably destroying quite a bunch of roots. Also, start your plant as low on the pole as possible. If I would have had a shoot already here, the bottom part is not going to miraculously increase in leaf size retrospectively. The whole idea here is that the plant roots into the moss pole, creates a larger root system within the moss pole. The vertical exposure is signalizing to the plant, hey, this is exactly how we grow in nature. In nature, we grow up a tree, let's go. And the plant starts maturing. But it's not going to do all of that in hindsight. It's only really going to apply to the newest node. So I want the newest node to be on the moss pole as low as possible so that as many nodes as possible can root into the pole so that by the time I eventually have to chop and propagate and so on, the plant has had the most time and space to establish a root system. Well, that then also kind of implies that we should really start with a small plant or a cutting like I have over here. If you're propagating in water, I would recommend to not propagate it for too long. I do think this was probably propagated for a little while too long. I had other priorities. Sometimes when the plant has been propagating in water for too long, it has a harder time adjusting to the chunky aeroid mix. If you have a plant that's currently in a more water retentive mix, but you would like to switch to a chunky aeroid mix because you're worried about the water retention due to the moss pole, then I would maybe go half-half. Maybe take some of the existing substrate and just add some chunky components to it and then pot it up. So the plant isn't experiencing too much shock by a complete change in medium so quickly in one, right? And then maybe with the next iteration you can switch to a fully chunky aeroid mix. And lastly, think about what you're trying to achieve in the first place. What you're trying to achieve in the long run. What do you want this plant to look like in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time? And choose a moss pole accordingly. Again, I'll link my tutorial down below where I give you all of the pros and cons between the different kinds of poles, but also I wanted this to be lush, so I potted up 3 cuttings over here. Of course, I could also just plant 1 and eventually chop it, but the earlier you propagate your plant into multiple cuttings, the earlier you can start 3 plants on here. The earlier you'll have 3 lush plants and so on. So the earlier you chop, the earlier you can grow multiples, the more leaves you will have ultimately. So I know at the beginning you don't necessarily want to propagate because it sets the plant back and it's going to take a little while longer. Yet again, honestly, the earlier you can propagate the plant, the earlier you'll end up with an end result that you'll actually really, really appreciate. Well, let me water this in and then I'll be back with you once we see something happening with this plant. And welcome back. It has only been 2 weeks, but I'm already seeing amazing signs of growth that show me that my process was successful. So let me bring you closer. First things first, let's peel this off. Sorry, AJ. Oh, AJ hates when I keep them on. I see lots and lots of root growth, and that's obviously the most important aspect for me at the moment. There's some teeny tiny roots here, but much more obvious, there's a big root over here. Couple of big roots over here. Yep, so I think you can see all of that. Another big one here. And anything in the back? No, well that's not unexpected, that's where the pole is, right? Root growth is the first thing I look out for. That's why I love using the see-through pots. Obviously the see-through pots also come in handy when assessing watering requirements and so on. But first and foremost, I love them to assess root health. That shows me that the actual repot from water, which I kept it in for way too long, was successful. It's taking to my new aeroid mix. So that means it's just a matter of time until I see growth. That in itself has absolutely nothing to do with the moss pole. That is just a normal repot. I just happen to also put a moss pole into the pot at the same time as repotting the plant. So this is something you can apply to every other plant as well, an alocasia, anything, right? Doesn't need to be a moss pole. But I happen to also put a moss pole in here. So let's have a look what happened there. So you can see, no, you probably can't because these leaves are in there. You can see that over here, this root, you can see that this root over here has definitely taken to the moss pole, and where I fiddled it into the moss pole, there is a little bit of root like growing in there. So it would be good to have a see-through pole as well, but at the same time I don't like them. I do think I can see something coming up here. I'm very confident that this plant has rooted into the moss pole, and probably within a couple of weeks I'll actually see roots coming out the top. Sorry, I just wanted to show you something and I ripped the root out, but I suppose for demonstration purposes this is a good example. This root over here, I just ripped out of the moss pole. Sorry, I'll just really gently put it back in. But that found its way there by itself. Oh well, by itself. I told it where to go with this earlier, right? But that was definitely new growth. Hope I didn't disturb any of your beautiful progress, but YOLO. I can take this and I can now maybe pin this new shoot on here instead. There you go. Get closer there. Yeah. And from here on, it's just staying patient and letting the plant climb up. I can use the U-shaped wires to continuously help the plant stay on the pole. But if you have a consistent light exposure from the front, the plant should technically do all of that by itself. The plant will find its own way because the roots are attracted to moisture. Anyway, I wanted to keep it short and sweet. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment. And hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.